Take a look at this chart. It shows the countries that are both best and worst prepared to handle an epidemic. But if you've been following the news at all, or if you saw my video from last week, you'll know that the opposite has been true. I mean, just look at this data in map form, and then compare it to this map of COVID-19 severity across the world. These maps are practically the exact inverse of the other. The US, which supposedly was the most prepared, leads the world in the number of COVID-19 cases, and also in the number of COVID-19 deaths. And the countries that were seemingly also prepared are not that far behind. So what happened here? I think it's important to acknowledge where this preparedness ranking is coming from. So it was developed by a group of researchers. Each country was given a score called the Global Health Security Index. And the researchers evaluated things like the capacity of the healthcare system, a country's ability to detect and report infections, or the general risk environment. Like, is this a country where people are largely living close together in slums or villages, or are they largely living in isolated homes? So they use publicly available data for these evaluations. And what's one of the best indicators of a country's capacity to be able to respond to a crisis? Money. Economic power, how developed a nation is, how educated its citizens are. And you really can't blame the researchers here. Logically, we all know that viruses aren't racist. A virus isn't going to not infect someone just because they're white or black or brown, or because they're from the US or Equatorial Guinea. But be honest, before March, did you ever think that COVID-19 would affect the US to this degree? Or France, or the Netherlands, or the UK, or Italy? Because the most devastating outbreaks that occurred in the 2000s, when we have all been alive, did take hold in regions that are under-resourced. It was cholera in Hispaniola, it was Ebola in West Africa, measles in the Congo, swine flu in India. And whenever news of these outbreaks came, we've always had the mindset of, that's never going to happen here. If you had a friend that was prone to anxiety during the Ebola epidemic, there's a good chance you told them, don't worry about it. Even if it comes to the US, we can handle it. Well, a virus did come, and we did not handle it. And there's obviously many reasons for that are too complex to summarize here. And maybe there is a world in which the government followed the plan in the so-called pandemic playbook, and we were able to flatten the curve. But I'd argue that this denialist thinking of it's not going to affect us and it's not going to affect me is exactly why we're here in the first place. Because we knew the virus existed by December. By March, we saw what had happened in Italy. Those in power had all the knowledge they needed to act. But they didn't. And even now, more than 8 months into the pandemic, you have people foregoing masks and having large gatherings at a really alarming rate. Meanwhile, look at Puerto Rico, or the Sioux tribe in the Dakotas. These are communities that knew if the virus made contact, it would devastate them. So they acted with speed and with extreme caution. They put up checkpoints, they enforced curfews, and took some of the most dramatic steps to mitigate the potential spread of disease before most people had even acknowledged the threat. The US and other countries in a similar position had the opportunity and the time to respond. We missed all of those signals, and more than 1 million people have died. So here's where the data science comes in. You might have seen this graph before. It shows the number of cases by date of diagnosis, but it also shows the estimated date that each of these cases first contracted the virus for Hubei, China. The Chinese CDC collected this data by asking patients during their diagnosis when their symptoms started. This graph is really important because it clearly communicates why it was important for Hubei to lock down on January 23rd. Even though there were less than 1,000 COVID-19 cases at the time, the turquoise grayish curve shows that the true number of cases was much higher. And the fact that they locked down as early as they did is probably why they were able to shut it down as quickly as they did. Unfortunately, other countries have not collected this two-sided data set that Hubei, China has. So this data on when people first contracted the virus is not widely available. So I tried to model this data for other countries based on what is known about Hubei and the virus itself. I don't want to get too technical in this video. I've written up a blog post for how I calculated the model, and if there's enough interest, maybe I'll make a part 2 explaining this model in further depth and also answering any questions you might have. But let's look at the US model as an example. The blue curve here represents the confirmed number of cases by date of diagnosis, and the red curve is my estimation of when the virus was actually contracted. The red curve is essentially a shift and a normalization of the blue curve. There is a bit more sophisticated analysis there, but that's the gist of it. What's important is this line down below. So this line is a rudimentary calculation of the growth rate. It's taking the number of cases from the red curve and dividing it by the number of cases in the red curve from the previous day. This number has to be below 1, because if it's above 1, then that means that each person who gets COVID-19 is spreading it to at least one more person who hasn't had it, meaning that eventually the whole world gets it. So it's critical that this rate is less than 1. And you can see the US isn't doing a great job on that. There's times that it's below 1, but just barely, like 0.993. Okay, so I feel like I need to explain this growth rate a little bit more. So let's take this example. On May 30th, my model estimates that there were 21,935 cases of coronavirus contracted in the US. And the growth rate here is 1.008. So that means that every day from this point on, there are 0.8% more cases than the day before. So I have my calculator here. On day 1, we have 21,935. On day 2, we'll have approximately 22,110. After a week, it will be about 23,193. After a month, it gets to about 28,000. And after a year, you're suddenly at 402,000. So exponential growth is no joke. It can, especially with this number 1.008, I mean, that's just barely above 1. And let's be honest, even if it was 1, that still wouldn't be great, because that just means that we're getting 21,935 cases per day. Even a week after, like 21,935 times 7 is more than 150,000 cases. That's why I say the growth rate needs to be under 1. Even if it's at 1 and we just hit there and it stays constant, there's no end in sight. It has to be below 1. The number of cases for each new day has to be less than they were for the previous day in order for the end to be in sight. I hope that's clear. When I did this analysis for other countries, I fully expected countries like South Korea or New Zealand that successfully have flattened the curve to be well below the growth rate of 1. Unfortunately, it's a similar story with similar trends. Let's look at South Korea, for example. They did flatten the case curve, but the growth rate never really decreased beyond 0.9, meaning they never really eradicated the possibility of another COVID-19 spike. And when you look at the graph, that spike did eventually come in late July, early August. The same is true for almost every country you look at: Spain, Italy, Greece, the United Kingdom, Azerbaijan, Iran, Germany, Ethiopia, Chile. No matter where I looked, it was the same story. Even if the curve of the cases has flattened, that growth rate is always around 0.9 or 1. And I did make an interactive dashboard for this data if you want to explore it yourself, if you want to look at a country that I haven't talked about in this video. Link is in the description. And I found this website, rt.live. They're doing a slightly more sophisticated calculation of the growth rate than I am, and they're only doing it for the US, but it's effectively the same results. All of the states have growth rates of above 1, and those that are below are just barely below it. So why is this bad? I mean, the rates are below 1, right? It will go away eventually. Well, let's look at a case study. So in South Korea on June 19th, my model estimated that the country had reached a growth rate of 0.979. If we hold this growth rate constant, then using some back-of-the-hand calculations, that means the virus will last for another 48 days in the country before dying out. And on June 19th, my model estimated that there were 46 new cases of the coronavirus in the country. So assuming a growth rate of 0.979, the number of new cases of each succeeding day will be 98% of the previous day's new cases. So that's 46 cases on the first day, 45 on the next day, 44 the day after, and so on. After 48 days of this, you'll have had 1,416 more cases before the virus dies out in the country. And now let's look at the US. On May 7th, we had reached a growth rate of 0.992, just barely below 1, but hey, still there. And on that same day, my model estimated that there were 23,650 new cases of coronavirus in the country. So assuming that that growth rate of 0.992 remains constant, again, that means the virus will die out within 125 days in the US. And using the same calculations that we did for South Korea, it shows that there will be 1,881,737 new cases of coronavirus before it dies out, even though the virus is on the decline, right? Which is why I say, even if that growth rate is below 1, it's not the all clear path. It still means that there's a significant chunk of time before the virus dies out, and that people will continue to contract the virus in that time. Obviously, the biggest flaw in this logic here is that growth rates do not remain constant. You can't just hold things constant like that and use it to predict the number of cases or the time it will take for the virus to die out. If anything, the growth rate is just an indicator of how quickly the virus is spreading at any given point in time. All of that to say, there's a lot wrong with the logic of everything I just spelled out, but it's a thought experiment. It's just to sort of convey the importance of this growth rate metric. And in that thought experiment we just did, I said that within 125 days after May 7th, we should expect to see 2 million more cases. In fact, we actually saw an increase of more than 5 million cases during that time. On May 7th, there were 1.3 million cases. 125 days later, September 9th, we were at 6.65 million. So that should hammer the point home, right? Growth rates do not remain constant. They can go up, like they did in the US, or they can go down, which is sort of the ideal scenario here. But what is the takeaway here? Stay the fuck inside, that's the takeaway. I say as I'm outside. And let's hope we get a working vaccine soon. Because between the denialist thinking of much of the world and the way these counts are looking, there's not a whole lot of hope. And this is not the conclusion I wanted to be making here. I wanted to show that the lockdowns in countries like South Korea were extremely effective, but the truth is that it's the bare minimum. Because even with the lockdown, given how insanely viral this disease is, it only takes a couple of days of opening back up or a couple of people to go against recommendations, and you've got spikes and spikes and spikes again, and suddenly you have round 2. So please, 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 I don't know if I can say anything that the countless doctors and epidemiologists haven't said to convince you otherwise, but yeah, stay inside. It's literally the bare minimum. We need to do that to even get below 1, and as you might have noticed in the US chart, we're not below 1 right now. We're significantly above 1. That means that there's no end in sight. That means that if we kept things are as they are right now, coronavirus would never go away. The cases would continue to exponentially grow. They'll continue to spread. And it will be our fault. So yeah, a bit of a somber end, but it's the truth. I don't want to sugarcoat or cookie cutter anything. But yeah, let me know what you thought of this. This was a little bit of a different type of video than I normally do. I'm not sure I explained my thinking all that well, so I do feel like I need to do part 2. I'm also like, yeah, subscribe if you're into data science content and you want to see more of that. And follow me on Twitter at vastava_. I couldn't claim the original at vastava, unfortunately, but that's okay. You make do with what you got. As always, there will be a hint for what my next video is about at the end of this video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.